On this day in history, September 1st, 1422, after the death of his father, King Henry V, Henry VI succeeds him to the throne of the Kingdom of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Henry. Henry VI, born 1421, died 1471, King of England, son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, was born at Windsor on December 6, 1421. He became King of England on September 1st, 1422, and a few weeks later, on the death of his grandfather, Charles VI, was proclaimed King of France also. Henry V had directed that Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, should be his son's preceptor. As early as 1423, the baby king was made to appear at public functions and take his place in Parliament. He was knighted by his uncle Bedford at Leicester in May 1426, and on November 6, 1429, was crowned at Westminster. Early in the next year, he was taken over to France, and after a long delay, crowned in Paris on December 16, 1431. His return to London, February 14, 1432, was celebrated with a great pageant devised by Lydgate. During these early years, Bedford ruled France wisely, and first with success, but he could not prevent the mischief which Humphrey of Gloucester caused both at home and abroad. Even in France, the English lost ground steadily after the victory of Joan of Arc before Orleans in 1429. The climax came with the death of Bedford and defection of Philip of Burgundy in 1435. This closed the first phase of Henry's reign. There followed 15 years of vain struggle in France and growing disorder at home. The determining factor in politics was the conduct of the war. Cardinal Beaufort, and after him Suffolk, sought by working for peace to secure at least Guienne and Normandy. Gloucester courted popularity by opposing them throughout, and with him was Richard of York, who stood next in succession to the crown. Beaufort controlled the council, and it was under his guidance that the king began to take part in the government. Thus it was natural that, as Henry grew to manhood, he seconded heartily to the unpopular and difficult peace policy. Henry was unfortunate in his advisers. The cardinal was old, his nephews John and Edmund Beaufort were incompetent, Suffolk was tactless. Suffolk, however, achieved a great success by negotiating the marriage of Henry to Margaret of Anjou in 1445. Humphrey of Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort both died early in 1447. Suffolk was now all-powerful in the favor of the king and queen, but his home administration was unpopular, whilst the incapacity of Edmund Beaufort ended in the loss of all Normandy and Guienne. Suffolk's fall in 1450 left Richard of York the foremost man in England. Henry's reign then entered on its last phase of dynastic struggle. Kay's rebellion suggested first that popular discontent might result in a change of rulers, but York, as heir to the throne, could bide his time. The situation was altered by the mental derangement of the king and the birth of his son in 1453. York, after a struggle, secured the protectorship and for the next year ruled England. Then Henry was restored to sanity, and the Queen and Edmund Beaufort, now Duke of Somerset, to power. Open war followed, with the defeat and death of Somerset at St. Albans on May 22, 1455. Nevertheless, a hollow peace was patched up, which continued during 4 years with lack of all governance. In 1459, war broke out again. On July 10, 1460, Henry was taken prisoner at Northampton and forced to acknowledge York as heir, to the exclusion of his own son. Richard of York's death at Wakefield, December 29, 1460, and the Queen's victory at St. Albans, February 17, 1461, brought Henry his freedom and no more. Edward of York had himself proclaimed king, and by his decisive victory at Taunton on March 29th, put an end to Henry's reign. For over 3 years Henry was a fugitive in Scotland. He returned to take part in an abortive rising in 1464. A year later he was captured in the north and brought a prisoner to the Tower. For 6 months in 1470 to 1471 he emerged to hold a shadowy kingship as Warwick's puppet. Edward's final victory at Tewkesbury was followed by Henry's death on May 21, 1471, certainly by violence, perhaps at the hands of Richard of Gloucester. Henry was the most hapless of monarchs. He was so honest and well-meaning that he might have made a good ruler in quiet times, but he was crushed by the burden of his inheritance. He had not the genius to find a way out of the French entanglement or the skill to steer a constitutional monarchy between rival factions. Henry's very virtues added to his difficulties. He was so trusting that anyone could influence him. so faithful that he would not give up a minister who had become impossible. Thus, even in the middle period, he had no real control of the government. Religious observances and study were his chief occupations. For education he was really zealous. The planning of his great foundations at Eton, 1440, and King's College, Cambridge, 1441, was the one thing which absorbed his interest. To both, he was more than a royal founder, and the credit of the whole scheme belongs to him. Henry's only son was Edward, Prince of Wales, born 1453, died 1471, who, having shared the many journeys and varying fortunes of his mother Margaret, was killed after the Battle of Tewkesbury, May 4th, 1471, by some noblemen in attendance of Edward IV. On this day in history, September 2nd, 31 BC, as part of the final war of the Roman Republic, the Battle of Actium is fought, where, off the western coast of Greece, forces of Octavian defeat troops under Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Actium. Actium belonged originally to the Corinthian colonists of Anactorium, who probably founded the worship of Apollo, Actius, and the Actia. In the 3rd century it fell to the Acarnanians, who subsequently held their synods there. Actium is chiefly famous as the site of Octavian's decisive victory over Mark Antony, September 2nd, 31 BC. This battle ended a long series of ineffectual operations. The final conflict was provoked by Antony, who is said to have been persuaded by Cleopatra to retire to Egypt and give battle to mask his retreat. But lack of provisions and the growing demoralization of his army would sufficiently account for his decision. The fleets met outside the Gulf, each over 200 strong. The totals given by ancient authorities are very conflicting. Antony's heavy fighting craft endeavored to close and crush the enemy with their artillery. Octavian's light and mobile craft made skillful use of skirmishing tactics. During the engagement, Cleopatra suddenly withdrew her squadron and Antony slipped away behind her. His flight escaped notice, and the conflict remained undecided until Antony's fleet was set on fire and thus annihilated. On this day in history, September 3rd, 301, San Marino, one of the smallest nations in the world and the world's oldest republic still in existence, is founded by St. Marinus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the republic. San Marino, a republic in northern Italy, 14 miles southwest of Rimini by road. It is the smallest republic in the world, 32 square miles in area. According to tradition, the republic was founded by Marinus, a native of Arb, probably after the 4th century. The Castellum Sancti Marini is mentioned in 755. The oldest document in the Republican archives mentions the abbot of San Marino in 885. The Republic, as a rule, avoided the faction fights of the Middle Ages, but joined the Ghibellines and was interdicted by the Pope in 1247-49. After this, it was protected by the Montefeltro family, later Dukes of Urbino, and the papacy, and successfully resisted the attempts of Sigismondo Malatesta against its liberty. In 1503, it fell into the hands of Cesare Borgia, but soon regained its freedom. Other attacks failed, but civil discords in the meantime increased. Its independence was recognized in 1631 by the papacy. In 1739, Cardinal Alberoni attempted to deprive it of its independence, but this was restored in 1740 and was respected by Napoleon. The arms of the Republic and 3 peaks, each crowned with a tower. There are traces of 3 different enceintes of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The principal church, Pieve, in classical style, dates from 1826 to 38 and contains the body of St. Marinus. The old church is first mentioned in 951. The available armed forces of the Republic form a total of about 1,200 men, all citizens able to bear arms being technically obliged to do so from the age of 16 to 60 years. It issues its own copper coinage, which circulates in Italy also, but Italian money is current for the higher values. Most of the Republic falls within the Diocese of Montefeltro, a small portion within that of Rimini. The peaceful revolution of March 25, 1906 restored the original system of election to the council, which had become a close corporation, renewed by co-option, by the Arengo, or Assembly of Heads of Families, 1/3 of the council being henceforth renewable every 3 years. But in September 1920, the council resigned in a body and enlarged the Arengo into a single constituency, electing the 60 councillors under practically universal suffrage and proportional representation. San Marini's public life takes its color from Italy, thus the Catholic Popular Party there, as in Italy, became powerful, and socialism, imported from abroad, was largely represented, at least until fascism appeared. Pending the election of their successors after the vote of 1920, the 2 half-yearly presidents of the Republic, for the first time since 1787, remained in office after their 6 months legal tenure had expired, and for the first time since 1740, the new Capitani Reggente came into power on December 5th instead of October 1st or April 1st, the time-honored dates, a return to which was effected at the ensuing election of presidents. In World War I, the Germans accused the Republic of espionage through the wireless station on Mount Titano, which stands 2,437 feet above the sea. When Italy entered the war, San Marino showed its sympathies by voting £1,500 for the Italian sufferers, and one of the regents publicly expressed his hope for an Italian victory. San Marino has been, since 1862, in treaty relations with Italy. In 1921, the fight of socialists into the Republic and the punitive expedition of the fascisti in search of them led San Marino to invoke the aid of the Italian Carabinieri. The Republic no longer confers titles for a consideration, but finds a fruitful source of revenue in the frequent changes of its postage stamps, first issued in 1877 and divided into 2 series, one for foreign and the other for internal postage in 1899. However, it had to resort to a loan, and new taxes were imposed to provide higher salaries for officials, causing the peasant rising in 1910, but it steadily refused the offer of a gaming table. Newspapers were established in the Republic. The only exports besides postage stamps are stone from Mount Titano. The legendary founder of San Marino was a Dalmatian stonecutter, and the strong wine grown on this volcanic soil. The museum contains, among other curiosities, the banner of Garibaldi's Italic Legion, which sought refuge at San Marino in 1849. The archives were rearranged and described by Malagola. The population in 1939 was 14,547. On this day in history, September 4th, 1282, Peter III of Aragon becomes the King of Sicily. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Peter III, King of Aragon, born 1236, died 1286, son of James the Conqueror and Yolanda, daughter of Andrew II of Hungary, daughter of Manfred of Beneventum. He claimed Naples and Sicily from Charles, Duke of Anjou, thus beginning the strife of the Angevin and Aragonese in southern Italy. His conquest of Sicily earned him the surname of the Great. He repelled an invasion of Catalonia by the French king and died November 8, 1286. On this day in history, September 5th, 1725, the wedding of Louis XV and Maria Lesinska. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Queen Consort. Marie Lesinska, born 1703, died 1768, Queen Consort of France, was born at Breslau on June 23, 1703, being the daughter of Stanislaw Lesinski, who in 1704 became King of Poland, and of Catherine Opalinska. During a temporary flight from Warsaw, the child was lost and eventually discovered in a stable. On another occasion, she was for safety's sake hidden in an oven. In his exile, Stanislaus found his chief consolation in superintending the education of his daughter. Her marriage with Louis XV took place at Fontainebleau on September 5, 1725. Marie's one attempt to interfere in politics, an effort to prevent the disgrace of the Duke of Bourbon, was the beginning of her husband's alienation from her, and after the birth of her 7th child, Louise, Marie was practically deserted by Louis, who openly avowed a series of liaisons. She died at Versailles on June 24, 1768. On this day in history, September 6, 1492, Christopher Columbus sails from La Gomera in the Canary Islands, his final port of call before crossing the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Columbus's first voyage. The adventurers numbered 88 souls, and on Friday, August 3, 1492, at 8 in the morning, the little fleet weighed anchor and stood for the Canary Islands. An abstract of the admiral's diary made by Las Casas is yet extant, and from it many particulars may be gleaned concerning this first voyage. 3 days after the ships had set sail, the Pinta lost her rudder. The admiral was in some alarm, but confronted himself with the reflection that Martin Pinzon was energetic and ready-witted. They had, however, to put in at Tenerife to refit the caravel. On September 6th, they weighed anchor once more with all haste, Columbus having been informed that 3 Portuguese caravels were on the lookout to intercept him. On September 13th, the westerly variations of the magnetic needle were, for the first time, observed. On the 15th, a meteor fell into the sea at 4 or 5 leagues distance. Soon after they arrived at those vast plains of seaweed called the Sargasso Sea, while, at the time, writes the Admiral, they had most temperate breezes, the sweetness of the mornings being especially delightful. On the 17th the men began to murmur. They were frightened by the strange phenomena of the variation of the compass, but the explanation Columbus gave restored their tranquillity. On the 18th they saw many birds, and a great ridge of low-lying clouds, and they expected to see land. On the 20th they saw boobies and other birds, and they were sure the land must be near. In this, however, they were disappointed, and thenceforth Columbus, who was keeping all the while a double reckoning, one for the crew and one for himself, had great difficulty in restraining the evil disposed from the excesses they meditated. On the 25th, Martin Alonso Pinzon raised the cry of land, but it proved false, as did the rumor to the same effect on October 7th, from the Nina, but on the 11th the Pinta fished up a cane, a pole, a stick, which appeared to have been wrought with iron, and a board, while the Nina sighted a branch covered with berries, and with these signs all of them breathed and were glad. On 10 o'clock that night Columbus perceived and pointed out a light ahead, and at 2 in the morning on Friday, October 12th, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Nina, announced the appearance of what proved to be the New World. The land sighted was an island, called by the Indians Guanahani, and named by Columbus San Salvador. It is generally identified with Watling Island. The same morning Columbus landed, richly clad, and bearing the royal banner of Spain. He was accompanied by the brothers Pinzon, bearing banners of the Green Cross, a device of the admirals, and by a great part of the crew. When they had all given thanks to God, kneeling upon the shore, and kissed the ground with tears of joy for the great mercy received, the admiral named the island, and took solemn possession of it for their Catholic majesties of Castile and Leon. At the same time, such of the crews as had shown themselves doubtful and mutinous sought his pardon weeping, and prostrated themselves at his feet. The voyage resulted in the discovery of the islands of Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Rum Cay, Fernandina, Lond Island, Isabella, Crooked Island, Cuba or Juana, named by Columbus in honor of the young Prince of Spain, and Hispaniola, Haiti, and San Domingo. Off the last of these, the Santa Maria went aground, owing to the carelessness of the steersman. No lives were lost, but the ship had to be unloaded and abandoned, and Columbus, who was anxious to return to Europe with the news of his achievement, resolved to plant a colony on the island, to build a fort of the materials of the stranded hulk, and to leave the crew. The fort was called La Navidad. 44 Europeans were placed in charge. On January 4th, 1493, Columbus, who had lost sight of Martin Pinzon, set sail alone in the Nina for the east, and 2 days afterwards the Pinta joined her sister ship. A storm separated the vessels, and Columbus did not reach the island of Santa Maria in the Azores until February 18th. He was threatened with capture by the Portuguese governor, who could not for some time be brought to recognize his commission. On February 24th, however, he was allowed to proceed, and on March 4th the Nina dropped anchor off Lisbon. The King of Portugal received the admiral with the highest honors. On March 13th, the Nina put out from the Tagus, and 2 days afterwards, Friday the 15th, she reached Palos. The court was at Barcelona, and thither Columbus proceeded. He entered the city in a sort of triumphal procession, was received by their majesties in full court, and seated in their presence, related the story of his wanderings, exhibited the rich and strange spoils of the new-found lands, the gold, the cotton, the parrots, the curious arms, the mysterious plants, the unknown birds and beasts, and the Indians he had brought with him for baptism. All his honors and privileges were confirmed to him. The title of Don was conferred on himself and his brothers. He rode at the king's bridle. He was served and saluted as a grandee of Spain. A new and magnificent scutcheon was also blazoned for him, May 4th, 1493, whereon the royal castle and lion of Castile and Leon were combined with the 5 anchors of his own coat of arms. On May 3rd to 4th, Alexander VI granted bulls confirming to the crowns of Castile and Leon all the lands discovered, or to be discovered, west of the line of demarcation drawn 100 leagues west of the Azores, on the same terms as those on which the Portuguese held their colonies along the African coast. A new expedition was got ready to secure and extend the discoveries already made. On this day in history, September 7th, 1159, Cardinal Rolando Bandinelli is elected Pope Alexander III, prompting the election of Cardinal Octaviano Monticelli as Antipope Victor IV the same day. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Pope. Alexander III, Orlando Bandinelli, Pope from 1159 to 1181, was a Sienese and a teacher of canon law in Bologna and author of the Stroma, or the Summa Magistri Rolandi, one of the earliest commentaries on the Decretum Gratiani, and of sentences, based on the Introductio ad Theologiam of Abelard. In 1153 he became papal chancellor, and was the leader of the cardinals opposed to Friedrich Barbarossa. On September 7, 1159, he was chosen to succeed Adrian IV, a minority of the cardinals, however, electing the cardinal priest Octavian, who assumed the name of Victor IV. This antipope and his successors, Paschal III, 1164-68, and Calixtus III, 1168-78, had the imperial support, but after the defeat of Legnano in the Peace of Venice, 1177, recognized Alexander as pope. On March 12, 1178, Alexander returned to Rome, which he had been compelled to leave twice, from 1162 to 1165, and again in 1167. The first period he spent in France, the latter chiefly in Gaeta, Benevento, Anagni, and Venice. In March 1179, Alexander held the Third Lateran Synod, reckoned by the Roman Catholic Church as the 11th Ecumenical Council. Its acts embody among them the present law requiring that no one may be elected pope without the votes of 2/3 of the cardinals. This synod marks the summit of Alexander's power. Besides checkmating Barbarossa, he had humbled Henry II of England in the affair of Thomas Becket. He had confirmed the right of Alfonso I of Portugal to the crown, and even as a fugitive he had enjoyed the favor and protection of Louis VII of France. Nevertheless, soon after the close of the synod, the Roman Republic forced Alexander to leave the city, which he never re-entered. And on September 29, 1179, some nobles set up the antipope Innocent III. By the judicious use of money, however, Alexander got him into his power, so that he was deposed in January 1180. In 1181, Alexander excommunicated William the Lion of Scotland and put the kingdom under interdict. The great pope died at Civita Castellana on August 30th, 1181. On this day in history, September 8th, 1198, Philip of Swabia, Prince of Hohenstaufen, is crowned King of Germany, King of the Romans. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the king. Philip, circa 1177 to 1208. German king and Duke of Swabia, the rival of Emperor Otto IV, was the 5th and youngest son of Emperor Frederick I and Beatrix, daughter of Renaud III, Count of Upper Burgundy, and brother of the Emperor Henry VI. He entered the church, was made provost of Aix-la-Chapelle, and in 1190 or 1191 was chosen Bishop of Würzburg. Philip forsook his ecclesiastical calling and was made Duke of Tuscany in 1195, receiving an extensive grant of lands. In 1196 he became Duke of Swabia on the death of his brother Conrad, and in May 1197 he married Irene, daughter of the Eastern Emperor Isaac Angelos, and widow of Roger II, King of Sicily. Philip appears to have been designated as guardian of the young Frederick, afterwards the Emperor Frederick II, in case of his father's early death. In In 1197, he had set out to fetch Frederick from Sicily for his coronation when he heard of the emperor's death and returned at once to Germany. He found growing hostility to the kingship of a child and the absence of the two Welf claimants, Otto and Henry, the sons of Henry the Lion, made possible Philip's own election as German king at Mulhausen on March 8, 1198. He was crowned at Mainz on September 8th. Meanwhile, a number of princes hostile to Philip under the leadership of Adolf, the Archbishop of Cologne, had elected an anti-king in the person of Otto, second son of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. War followed, in which Philip drew his principal support from South Germany. In 1199, he received further accessions to his party and carried the war into his opponent's territory. In March 1201, Innocent III placed Philip and his associates under the ban and began to work for Otto. Otto, aided by Ottokar I, King of Bohemia, and Hermann I, Landgrave of Thuringia, drove him from North Germany and compelled him to seek, in vain, reconciliation with Innocent. The submission of Hermann of Thuringia in 1204 marks the turning point of Philip's fortunes, and he was soon joined by Adolf of Cologne and Henry I, Duke of Brabant. On January 6, 1205, he was crowned again by Adolf at Aix-la-Chapelle, though it was not till 1207 that his entry into Cologne practically brought the war to a close. Philip was then loosed from the papal ban. He was preparing to crush the last flicker of the rebellion in Brunswick when he was murdered at Bamberg, on June 21, 1208, by Otto of Wittelsbach, Count Palatine in Bavaria, to whom he had refused the hand of one of his daughters. He left 4 daughters, one of whom, Beatrix, afterwards married his rival, the Emperor Otto IV. Philip was a brave and handsome man, and contemporary writers, among whom was Walter von der Vogelweide, praise his mildness and generosity. On this day in history, September 9, 1488, Anne becomes sovereign Duchess of Brittany, becoming a central figure in the struggle for influence that leads to the union of Brittany and France. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Anne. Anne of Brittany, born 1477, died 1514, Duchess of Brittany and Queen Consort of France, daughter of Francis II, Duke of Brittany, and Marguerite de Foix. She was scarcely 12 years old when she succeeded her father as Duchess, September 9, 1488. Charles VIII aimed at establishing his authority over her claim. Alain de Albert wished to marry her. Jean de Rohan claimed the duchy, and her guardian, the Marshal de Rieux, was soon in open revolt against his sovereign. In 1489, the French army invaded Brittany. In order to protect her independence, Anne concluded an alliance with Maximilian of Austria, who married her by proxy, December 1490. But Maximilian was immersed in Austrian affairs and could not defend his bride, and in 1491 the young duchess was besieged at Rennes, and compelled to treat with Charles VIII. The terms of peace included the rupture of her marriage with Maximilian and marriage with Charles. The two sovereigns made a reciprocal agreement as to their rights and pretensions to the crown of Brittany, but in the event of Charles predeceasing her, Anne undertook to marry the heir to the throne. Nevertheless, in 1492, after the conspiracy of Jean de Rohan, who had endeavored to hand over the duchy to the King of England, Charles VIII confirmed the privileges of Brittany, and in particular guaranteed to the Bretons the right of paying only those taxes to which the Assembly of Estates consented. After the death of Charles VIII in 1498, without issue, Anne ruled in Brittany, and in January 1499 she married Louis XII, who had just repudiated Joan of France. The marriage contract was ostensibly directed in favor of the independence of Brittany, for it declared that Brittany should revert to the second son or to the eldest daughter of the two sovereigns, and, failing issue, to the neutral heirs of the Duchess. Until her death, Anne occupied herself personally with the administration of the duchy. In 1504, she made an agreement for the marriage of her daughter, Claude of France, to Charles of Austria, the future Emperor Charles V. But this unpopular agreement was broken, and the Queen had to consent to the betrothal of Claude to Francis of Angoulême, who in 1515 became King of France as Francis I. Thus the way was prepared for the definitive reunion of Brittany and France. On this day in history, September 10th, 506, the bishops of Visigothic Gaul meet in the Council of Agde. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the Synod. Synod of Agde, Concilium Agathonese. The 47 genuine canons of the Synod, September 11th, 506, dealt with discipline, church life, alienation of ecclesiastical property, and treatment of Jews. While favoring sacerdotal celibacy, the council laid rather rigid restrictions on monasticism. It commanded that the laity communicate at Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. The canons of Agde are based in part on earlier Gallic, African, and Spanish legislation, and some of them were reenacted by later councils. On this day in history, September 11th, 9 AD, the Battle of Teutoburger Forest ends. The Roman Empire suffers the greatest defeat of its history, and the Rhine is established as the border between the Empire and the so-called barbarians for the next 400 years. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Teutoburger Wald, 9 AD. At the opening of the Christian era, the country between the Rhine and the Vistula was covered by dense forests and occupied by numerous Germanic tribes. As Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul, so in turn did Augustus Caesar determine to conquer this region. To it he sent Drusus and Tiberius, both able generals, and by 15 BC, the Roman frontier was pushed out to the Danube. Between 12 and 9 BC, Drusus advanced as far as Aliso, probably near Paderborn, on the Lippe, built there a strong fortress, and moved on to the Elbe. Drusus dying at the early age of 30, Tiberius succeeded him in command, and having completed the subjugation of the tribes in 6 AD, he was replaced by Quintilius Varus, a man of luxurious habits and distributed by no cares. He began at once to uproot the old German customs, and by so doing consolidated the tribes against him. Varus had under his command some 50,000 men, and had administered his province for about a year, when a contingent of Cheruscan, one of the Germanic tribes, troops under the leadership of Arminius, returned to their country. Arminius was then in his 25th year, and had been educated in Rome. He bore the Romans no ill will until his return, when his indignation was roused by the behavior of Varus towards his countrymen. Seeing that he was powerless to strike at the Romans covered by their entrenchments, by flattery he gained over Varus, and then, in order to draw him away from the Rhinish fortresses, persuaded him to move his headquarters to the Weser. This he succeeded in doing. In the summer of 9 AD, Varus set out with the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, some cavalry and auxiliaries, in some 12,000 men to repress a local rising arranged by Arminius. He was warned of the danger, and was urged to secure Arminius and the other Cheruscan chiefs, who, with their men, formed the rear guard of his column. Refusing to listen to these warnings, from near Minden he entered the forests, followed by an immense train, and headed for Aliso. When the head of the column had become entangled in the brushwood near the hill of Teut, now called Grotenberg, Arminius quitted the rear, and followed by his comrades, by to the main. As the Romans reached the slopes of Teutoburg, the German hordes broke in on them from all sides. So trusting and blind was Varus that at first he thought it but rough horseplay. Soon, however, he was disillusioned, and was only able to beat back the incessant assaults by moving towards an open plateau. Here he entrenched. During September 9th, he burnt the impedimenta to lighten the column. On the 10th, it was attacked again. Though Varus showed great personal bravery, he gave no orders, and his troops lost confidence in him. With difficulty, they reached the entrance of the Dorn Pass, but a few miles from Aliso. Here Arminius had determined on his decisive attack. Blocking the further exit, he fell upon the flanks of the disheartened column, which broke and was slaughtered. Varus fell upon his own sword as his father had done at Philippi. The loss of the 3 Roman legions was more than a staggering blow to Augustus, for it marked a great turning point in European history. It showed that Rome was not invincible. It sent the frontier of the empire back from the Weser to the Rhine, and so prevented the Latinization of what today constitutes a large part of modern Germany. It denied to the barbarians of the north a high culture, and it encouraged them to sweep south with a low culture and barbarize Western Europe. Tactically, this battle is of small account. A Marius or a Caesar would have soon finished with Arminius, but its repercussions, not only on the history of war but on that of civilization, cannot be exaggerated, for they are felt today in the age-long quarrel between France and Germany, the Latin and the Teutonic outlooks. On this day in history, September 12th, 490 BC, the Battle of Marathon is fought. The conventionally accepted date for the Battle of Marathon. The Athenians and their Plataean allies defeat the first Persian invasion force of Greece. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Marathon. Marathon, a plain about 5 miles long by 2 miles wide on the east coast of Attica, 24 miles northeast of Athens. There is a large marsh at the northern end, from which extremity the Kynosura promontory, a mile long, ending in Cape Marathon, forms an anchorage sheltered from the north and east. From the village of Marathon, the Charada brook bisects the plain, and a small marsh lies at the southern end. Here, 490 BC, 9,000 Athenian and 1,000 Palatian heavy infantry defeated part of a Persian army under Datis and Artaphernes. During the Ionian revolt, the Athenians and Eretrians had aided the rebels in the attack on Sardis. The Persian king Darius ordered his generals to enslave Athens and Eretria and bring the slaves into his presence. Eretria, after a siege, was surrendered by treachery. The city was destroyed and the inhabitants enslaved. The Persian host, guided by Hippias, a former tyrant of Athens, landed at Marathon, thinking to do the same to the Athenians. When news of the fall of Eretria reached Athens, a courier, Pheidippides, was sent to Sparta for aid. Miltiades, with knowledge of a war and of the Persians, was selected as one of the Athenian generals under Polemarch Callimachus, and seems to have dominated the war council and dictated the plan of campaign. The Athenians marched on Marathon to delay the Persian advance in the passes leading to Athens and to enable the Plataeans and Spartans to join. On the march, the Plataeans came up. The passes were found unoccupied, and the Greeks took up a position in the Avlona Valley, covering the direct roads to Athens and flanking the southern road. The result was to pin down the Persians. Against the Greek position in a narrow valley with both flanks secured by hills, they could not use their cavalry. To advance by the southern road would commit their column to a defile between the mountains and the sea and enable the Greeks to fall upon their rear while the main body would be unable to come up. The re-embark would expose part of their army to almost certain disaster. In spite of the Spartan delay on account of a religious festival, time fought for the Athenians. While Spartans were on the Isthmus of Corinth, the Persians embarked their cavalry and part of their infantry to make a dash on Athens by sea. A rear guard, probably about 20,000 strong, was drawn up on the southern part of the plain parallel with the beach. Callimachus, probably on the advice of Miltiades, decided to attack. The date was probably September 21st. A mile from the Persian line, the Greeks were marshaled. The center thinned so as to extend the line to equal that of the Persians and strengthen the Athenian right under Callimachus and the Plataeans on the left. Down the sloping plain moved the bronze-clad Greeks. When the ranks came within range of the Persian missiles, they broke into a charge. The weak Athenian center recoiled, but the shock of the heavy Greek wings crushed in and rolled up the Persian flanks. The victorious Persian center was then dealt with. The hostile rearguard was destroyed, losing 6,400 killed. The Greeks lost 192. The Athenians then marched back to Athens and arrived in time to forestall a landing by the Persian main body. The failure of the Persians was due to neglect of security measures and lack of aggressive action, which resulted in failure to make use of superior numbers, and finally to a division of forces. The Greeks were prompt in action and sought to unite their strength for the decisive battle and bring it to bear against a part of the Persian army. Tactically, the successful double envelopment of the hostile flanks foreshadowed the design of Cannae. If at Marathon the situation is unlikely to have created intentionally, the opportunity at least was ably exploited. On this day in history, September 13th, 1609, Henry Hudson reaches the river that would later be named after him, the Hudson River. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the river. Verrazano proceeded a short distance up the Hudson by boat in 1524, but the first European to demonstrate its extent and importance was Henry Hudson, for whom the river derives its name. The Dutch later settled the valley. During the early days of colonization, a settlement by the Dutch and later by the English, the valley of the Hudson provided a natural highway to Canada via the Lake George, Lake Champlain route, and to western New York via the Mohawk Valley. During all of the early wars on the North American continent, the valley was a region of great strategic importance. It has been used in exploration, in war, and in commerce. Water transportation of the river itself, and later on via the Erie Canal to the Great Lakes, played a most important part in determining the location and building up of the great commercial, industrial, and transshipment centers at the mouth of the New York City area. The Valley of the Hudson has been the scene of many important historical events. During the Revolutionary War, an enormous chain was stretched across the river between Guy's Point and Constitution Island to prevent the passage of British ships. Benedict Arnold, while military commander of the forts in the locality, planned to surrender them to the British. He made his escape from his quarters on the east bank near the site of the village of Garrison to a British ship anchored in the river below. Fulton made his first successful experiments with steam navigation on the Hudson River. Washington Irving, who is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, has memorialized the valley in his stories. A highway bridge crosses the river at Bear Mountain Park, located on the river just above the naval station at Iona Island. This park is the summer playground of the people of New York City. Above Cornwall, the valley slopes gently away from the river, and the scenery, though not tame, cannot compare with the grandeur of the lower river. The Catskill Mountains are visible to the west. At Cornwall, the river enters the northern portals of the highlands between a series of hills, whose precipitous sides often rise abruptly from the water's edge. For about 16 miles, the river scenery is magnificent. Below Peekskill, the view from the river continues beautiful, but the banks are less precipitous. Beginning at Piermont, on the west bank, are the famous Palisades, which extend some 13 miles along the river to the south. These rock cliffs rise precipitously to a height of over 500 feet above the water. New York City, with its teeming millions and its enormous skyscrapers, is situated at the mouth of the river. A suspension bridge connecting New York City and Fort Lee on the New Jersey side was begun in 1928. Tunnels, or tubes for the trains, of the Pennsylvania Railroad, interurban electric lines, and vehicles have been constructed under the North River connecting New York City with the New Jersey side. On this day in history, September 14th, 81 AD, Domitian becomes emperor of the Roman Empire upon the death of his brother Titus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Domitian, Titus Flavius Domitianus, Roman emperor from 81 to 96 AD, the second son of Vespasian, was born at Rome on October 24th, 51 AD. When Vespasian was proclaimed emperor at Alexandria, Domitian escaped with difficulty from the temple of the capital, which had been set on fire by the Vitellians, and remained in hiding till his father's party proved victorious. After the fall of Vitellius, he was saluted as Caesar by the troops, obtained the city praetorship, and was entrusted with the administration of Italy till his father's return from the east. But although in his father's lifetime he was several times consul, and after his death was nominally the partner in the empire with his brother Titus, he took no part in public business, but lived in great retirement, devoting himself to a life of pleasure and of literary pursuits till he succeeded to the throne. The death of Titus, if not hastened by foul means, was at least eagerly welcomed by his brother. Domitian's succession, on September 13th, 81 AD, was unquestioned, and it would seem that he had intended, so far as his weak volition and mean abilities would allow, to govern well. Like Augustus, he attempted a reformation of morals and religion. He erected many temples and public buildings, amongst them the Odeum, a kind of theater for musical performances, and restored the temple of the Capitol. He passed many sumptuary laws, and issued an edict forbidding the overcultivation of vines to the neglect of corn growing. Finally, he took a personal share in the administration of justice at Rome, checked the activity of the informers, delatores, and exercised a jealous supervision over the governors of provinces. Even when Rome and Italy smarted beneath his proscriptions and extortions, the provinces were undisturbed. Though he took the title of imperator more than 20 times and enjoyed at least one triumph, Domitian's military achievements were insignificant. He defeated the Chatti, annexed the district of the Taunus, and established the Limes as a line of defense. But he suffered defeats at the hands of the Quadi, Sarmati, and Marcomanni. In Dacia, He received a severe check and was obliged to purchase peace, 90 AD, from Decebalus by the payment of a large sum of money and by guaranteeing a yearly tribute, the first instance in Roman history. His jealousy was provoked by the success of Agricola in Britain and was recalled to Rome 85 AD in the midst of his conquests, condemned to retirement and perhaps removed by poison. The revolt of Antonius Saturninus, the commander of the Roman forces in Upper Germany, 88 or 89 AD, marks the turning point in his reign. It was speedily crushed, but from that moment Domitian's character changed. He got rid of all whom he disliked on the charge of having part in the conspiracy, and no man of eminence was safe against him. He was in constant fear of assassination and distrusted all around him. During the last 3 years of his life, his behavior was that of a madman. He sentenced to death his own cousin and nephew by marriage, Flavius Clemens, whose wife he banished for her supposed leaning towards Judaism, Christianity. He was stabbed in the bedroom by a freedman of Clemens, named Stephanus, on September 18, 96 AD. On this day in history, September 15th, 1440, Gilles de Rais, one of the earliest known serial killers, is taken into custody upon an accusation brought against him by Jean de Malstroit, Bishop of Nantes. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Marshal. Gilles de Rais, or Retz, born 1404, died 1440, Marshal of France, the central figure of the 15th century Cause célèbre, was the son of Guy de Montmorency Laval, the adopted son and heir of Jeanne de Rais, and of Marie de Cron. He was born at Machical in September or October 1404, and was brought up by his grandfather, Jean de Cron. Chief among his great possessions was the barony of Rais, erected in the 16th century into the peerage duchy of Retz, south of the Loire, on the marches of Brittany. He joined the Montforts, supporting Jean V of Brittany against the house of Penthievre. He helped to release Duke John from Oliver de Blois, Count of Penthievre, and was rewarded by extensive grants of land, subsequently commuted by the Breton Parliament for money payments. In 1420 he married Catherine of Thouars, a great heiress of Brittany, La Vendée and Poitou. In 1426 he raised 7 companies of men-at-arms and began an active warfare against the English under Arthur de Richemont. He accompanied Joan of Arc to Orleans, fighting by her side at Orleans and afterwards at Jaucourt and Patay. He had advocated further measures against the English on the Loire before carrying out the coronation of Charles VII at Rheims. On July 17th he was made Marshal of France at Rheims. In the winter he was in Normandy at Louviers, whether with a view to the release of Joan, then a prisoner at Rouen, cannot be stated. He expended great sums in the king's service and maintained a court more suited to royal than baronial rank. He was a munificent patron of literature and music, and his library contained many valuable works, he himself being a skilled illuminator and binder. At the chief festivals he gave performances of mysteries and moralities, and it has been asserted that the Mystère de la Passion, acted at Angers in 1420, was staged by him in honor of his own marriage. The original draft of The Mystery of Orleans was probably written under his direction. In his financial difficulties he began to alienate his lands, selling his estates for small sums, providing his heirs with material for many lawsuits. Among those who profited by his prodigality were the Duke of Brittany and his chancellor, Jean de Malstroit, Bishop of Nantes. But in 1436 his kinsfolk appealed to Charles VII, who proclaimed further sales to be illegal. Jean V refused to acknowledge the king's right to promulgate a decree of this kind in Brittany, and replied by making Gilles de Rais lieutenant of Brittany and by acknowledging him as his brother-in-arms. Gilles hoped to redeem his fortunes by alchemy, and also spent large sums on necromancers, seeking to guarantee himself from evil consequences by extravagant charity and a splendid celebration of the rites of the church. The abominable practices of which he was really guilty seem to have escaped the notice of his equals or superiors, though suspected by the peasantry. His wife left him in 1434-35, and when his brother René de la Suze seized Champtoche, family considerations no doubt imposed silence. His servants kidnapped children, generally boys, who he tortured and murdered. The number of his victims was stated in the ecclesiastical trial to have been 140. In 1440, he came into conflict with the church by an act of violence which involved sacrilege and infringement on clerical immunity, and in the autumn he was arrested and cited before the Bishop of Nantes on various charges, the chief of which were heresy and murder. With the latter count, the ecclesiastical church was incompetent to deal, and Gilles refused to accept its jurisdiction, October 8th. Terrified by excommunication, however, he secured absolution by confession. A parallel inquiry was made by Pierre de l'Hopital, president of the Breton Parliament, by whose sentence he was hanged, not burned alive as it's sometimes stated, on October 26, 1440, with 2 of his accomplices. In view of his confessions, his guilt seems certain, but the irregularities of the proceedings, the fact that his chief accomplices went unpunished, taken together with the financial interest of Jean V in his ruin, have left a certain mystery over the trial. With the exception of the process of Joan of Arc, was the most famous in 15th century France. His name is connected with the tale of Bluebeard in local tradition at Machecoul, Tifol, Pornic, and Chimère. The records of the trial are preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, at Nantes, and elsewhere. On this day in history, September 16, 1908, the General Motors Corporation is founded. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the company. General Motors Corporation, incorporated in Delaware, October 13, 1916. To succeed a New Jersey company with a similar name formed September 16, 1908. For the purpose of manufacturing automotive equipment, is primarily an operating organization owning the assets of manufacturing divisions. It also owns a large part or all of the stock of a number of subsidiary and affiliated companies directly connected with its activities. Its products include Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, LaSalle, and Cadillac passenger cars, all with the body by Fisher. Chevrolet trucks and commercial cars, General Motor trucks, General cabs, and yellow coaches, such parts and accessories as AC spark plugs, speedometers, air cleaners, and oil filters, Delco hydraulic shock absorbers, Delco Remy batteries, ignition and starting systems, Harrison heaters and radiators, Hyatt roller bearings, inland steering wheels, and new departure ball bearings. Also Delco light electric plants and water systems, Delco heat oil-fired burners and furnaces, Frigidaire refrigeration and air conditioning equipment, Winton diesel and gasoline engines, and electromotive diesel-electric power plants for locomotives and streamlined trains. Outstanding capital stock on March 31st, 1940 consisted of 1,875,366 shares of $5 series preferred stock, no par value, with a declared value of $187,536,600, and 43,500,000 shares of common stock, $10 par value. There were no bonds. The corporation has plants in more than 60 cities in the United States and elsewhere. In 1939, it built and sold 1,727,086 cars and trucks. The total number of cars and trucks sold outside the United States and Canada in that year was 331,146. General Motors products are sold by approximately 25,000 dealers in more than 100 countries. In 1925, the corporation made 1 in every 5 cars produced in the United States and Canada. In 1926, 1 in every 4. In 1927 and subsequent years, about 1 in 3. Total sales in 1939 were $1,376,828,337. Total wages were more than $386 million. Average number of employees, 220,000. On this day in history, September 17, 1683, Antoine von Leeuwenhoek writes a letter to the Royal Society describing animalcules, later known as protozoa. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of protozoology. Protozoa were first discovered in the latter half of the 17th century by A. van Leeuwenhoek, 1632 to 1723, a Dutch amateur naturalist and chamberlain to the Sheriff of Delft. Leeuwenhoek carried on his investigations with magnifying glasses and microscopes he had designed and made himself. A systematic investigation and description of all known protozoa was undertaken for the first time by the Dane O. F. Müller, 1730 to 84. In the 19th century, C.G. Ehrenberg, professor of zoology in Berlin 1795 to 1876, tried to show that protozoa had an organization similar to that of the higher organisms. This attempt failed because Ehrenberg's scientific opponent, the Frenchman Dujardin, was able to demonstrate the unicellularity, in the essence at least, of the protozoa. The fact that protozoa were unicellular was enunciated by the German zoologists M. Schultz, 1861, and von Siebold. In the era of Darwinism, the protozoa were principally looked at from the point of view of the evolutionary theory. In them were seen the root forms of higher animals. Later on, protozoas were recognized as causers of disease. The first pathogenic protozoa, Nosem bombycis, was discovered by Pasteur. The greatest advance in the study of pathogenic protozoa began with the investigation of the Nagana cattle plague by David Bruce. By showing that this disease was caused by Trypanosoma brucei, he opened a new era of activity in protozoological research, which has carried on to the present day. In this period, the study of the body structure, life cycles, and physiology have equally received attention. Amongst these, the classical researches of the Englishman Ronald Ross and of the Italian B. Grassi deserve special attention, on account of their achievement with malaria. Also the work of German F. Sheldon, 1877 to 1906, on the life cycle of the Coccida and of many other protozoans, especially in regard to cytology. On this day in history, September 18th, 1180, Philip Augustus becomes King of France at the age of 15. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Philip II, born 1165, died 1223, known as Philip Augustus, King of France, son of Louis VII, and Adela, daughter of Theobald II, Count of Champagne, was born on August 21, 1165. On November 1, 1179, he was associated with his father as king by being crowned at Rheims, and at once his father's illness threw the responsibility of government on him, the death of Louis on September 19, 1180, leaving him sole king. His long strip of royal domain was hemmed in by the Angevin Empire on the west and by the Kingdom of Arles on the southeast. Henry II of England was feudal lord of the greater part of France, practically all west of a line which began at the Dieppe and ended at the foot of the Pyrenees, more than halfway across the Mediterranean, while at one point it nearly touching the Rhone. Philip's predecessors had consolidated the Capetian power within these narrow limits, but he himself was overshadowed by the power of his uncles, William, Archbishop of Rheims, Henry I, Count of Champagne, and Theobald V, Count of Blois and Chartres. He secured an ally against them, and, in addition to the royal domain, by marrying, on April 28, 1180, Isabella, or Elizabeth, daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Hainault, and of Marguerite, sister of Philip of Alsace, the reigning Count of Flanders, who ceded as Isabella's dowry the district afterwards called Artois. On June 28, 1180, Philip made a treaty with Henry II at Gisors, but from 1181 to 1185 he had to struggle against a feudal league of his Champagnard uncles and of other great barons, whose most active member was Stephen I, Count of Sancerre, 1152 to 1191. Having secured his position at home, the king turned against Henry II, and by the truce of Châteauroux in June 1187, gained Issendon and the seigneury of Fréteval in the Vendômois. Though the truce was for 2 years, Philip assembled an army in 1188 to invade Normandy, demanding Gisors and the conclusion of the marriage which had been arranged between his sister Alice and Richard of England, who had meanwhile deserted his father. But Richard took the cross and Philip seized the county of Berry, part of his dukedom. Further reconciliations and conferences followed, and Henry II, just before his death, did homage and surrendered the territories of Grasse and Issendon. Henry died 2 days later. Pledges of mutual good faith and fellowship were exchanged between Philip and Richard of England on December 30th, 1189, and they both prepared to go on the crusade. On this day in history, September 19th, 1676, Jamestown is burned to the ground by the forces of Nathaniel Bacon during Bacon's Rebellion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Jamestown, a former village in what is now James City County, Virginia, USA, on Jamestown Island, in the James River, about 40 miles above Norfolk. It was here that the first permanent English settlement in America was founded on May 14, 1607, that representative government was inaugurated on the American continent in 1619, and that Negro servitude was introduced into the original 13 colonies also in 1619. In Jamestown was the first Anglican church built in America. The settlement was in a low, marshy district which proved to be unhealthy. It was accidentally burned in January 1608 and was almost completely destroyed by Nathaniel Bacon in September 1676. The State House and other buildings were again burned in 1698, and after the removal of the seat of government of Virginia from Jamestown to the Middle Plantations, now Williamsburg, in 1699 the village fell rapidly into decay. Its population had never been large. It was about 490 in 1609 and 183 in 1623. The mortality was always very heavy. By the middle of the 19th century, the peninsula on which Jamestown had been situated had become an island, and by 1900 the James River had worn away the shore but had hardly touched the territory of the New Town, 1619, immediately east of the first settlement. Almost the only visible remains, however, were the tower of the brick church and a few gravestones. In 1900, the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, to which the site was deeded in 1893, induced the U.S. government to build a wall to prevent the further encroachment of the river. The foundation of several of the old buildings have since been uncovered, and in 1907 there were erected a brick church, which is as far as possible as a reproduction of the fourth one built in 1639-47. A marble shaft marking the site of the first settlement, another shaft commemorating the first house of Burgesses, a bronze monument to the memory of Captain John Smith, and another monument to the memory of Pocahontas. The founding at Jamestown of the first permanent English-speaking settlement in America was celebrated in 1907 by the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition, held on the grounds at Sewell's Point, on the shore of Hampton Roads. About 20 foreign nations, the federal government, and most of the states in the Union took part in the exposition. On this day in history, September 20th, 1378, Cardinal Robert of Geneva is elected as Pope Clement VII, beginning the Papal Schism. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the anti-pope. Clement VII, Robert of Geneva, died 1394, anti-pope, after occupying the episcopal sees of Theron and Cambrai, became a cardinal. In 1378 he took part in the election of Urban VI at Rome, and was perhaps the first to express doubts as to the validity of the tumultuous election. When the cardinals resolved to regard Urban VI as an intruder and the Holy See as still vacant, Robert of Geneva was elected pope on September 20th, 1378, and took the name of Clement VII. Thus originated the Great Schism of the West. Clement was supported by Queen Joanna of Naples, several Italian barons, and Charles V of France, and he eventually succeeded in winning to his cause Scotland, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, a great part of the Latin East, and Flanders. To wrest Rome from his rival, Clement incited Louis, Duke of Anjou, the eldest of the brothers of Charles V, to take arms in his favor, by the bait of a kingdom to be carved expressly out of the states of the Church, and to be called the Kingdom of Adria, coupled with the expectation of succeeding to Queen Joanna. These tempting offers gave rise to a series of expeditions into Italy, of which the most decisive result was the assuring of Provence to the Dukes of Anjou and afterwards to the Kings of France. Before his death, September 16, 1394, Clement realized the impossibility of overcoming by brute force an opposition which was founded on the convictions of the greater part of Catholic Europe. On this day in history, September 21st, 1745, a British government army led by Sir John Cope is defeated in less than 15 minutes by the Jacobite forces of Prince Charles Edward Stuart. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the location. Prestonpans, police borough, borough of Barony, parish, and watering place of East Lothian, Scotland, on the Firth of Forth, 9.5 miles east of Edinburgh, by the LNER. Population, 1931, 2,426. A mile to the east of the village is the site of a battle of 1745 in which Prince Charles Edward and his Highlanders gained a complete victory over the royal forces under Sir John Cope. The salt trade, formerly flourishing, has declined, There are manufactures of fire bricks, tiles, and pottery, besides brewing and soap making, and rich collieries at Tranent, 1 mile southeast, and elsewhere in the neighborhood. Fisheries are less important than formerly. There are harbors at Morrison's Haven to the west, and at Cockneys and Port Seton to the northeast, which form one borough, with a population of 2,526. On this day in history, September 22nd, 1586, as part of the 80 Years' War, a Spanish force led by the Marquis del Vasto successfully fights its way past a joint English-Dutch ambush in the Battle of Zutphen. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Zutphen, a town in the province of Gelderland, Holland, on the right bank of the IJssel, at the influx of the Berkel, and a junction station 18 miles north by northeast of Arnhem, by rail. Population, from 1940, 21,490. In the Middle Ages, it was the seat of a line of counts which became extinct in the 12th century. Having been fortified, the town stood several sieges, especially during the Wars of Freedom waged by the Dutch, the most celebrated fight under its walls being the one in September 1586, when Sir Philip Sidney was mortally wounded. Taken by the Spaniards in 1587, Zutphen was recovered by Maurice, Prince of Orange, in 1591, and except for 2 short periods, one in 1672 and the other during the French Revolutionary Wars, it then remained a part of the United Netherlands. German troops occupied it in World War II. The most important building is the Grote Kerk of St. Walpurgis, which dates from the 12th century and contains monuments of the former Counts of Zutphen and other objects of interest. The chapter house contains a pre-Reformation library, which includes some valuable messages and incunabula. There are some remains of the old town walls. The place has an active trade, especially in grain and in timber, floated down from the Black Forest by the Rhine and the IJssel. The industries include tanning, weaving, and oil and paper manufactures. About 3 miles to the north of Zutphen is the agricultural colony of Nederlandsch Metterij, founded by a private benefactor for the education of poor friendless boys in 1851. At 3 miles' distance, in the picturesque Achterhoek, are the medieval castles of Ruurlu and Vorden. On this day in history, September 23rd, 1122, Pope Calixtus II and Holy Roman Emperor Henry V agreed to the Concordat of Worms to put an end to the investiture controversy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Worms was known in Roman times as Borbeto Magus, which in the Merovingian age became Vermatia. The town had, before Caesar's time, become the capital of a German tribe, the Vangiones. Drusus is said to have erected a fort here in 14 BC. In 413, the Emperor Jovinus permitted the Burgundians under the king Gunther, or Gunther, to settle on the left bank of the Rhine between the Lauter and the Nay. Here they founded a kingdom with Worms as its capital. Adopting Arianism, they came into conflict with the Romans, and under their king Gundahar, or Gundekar, the Gunther of the Nibelungenlied, rose in 435 against the Roman governor Aetius, who called in the Huns against them. The destruction of Worms and the Burgundian kingdom by the Huns in 436 is the subject of heroic legends afterwards incorporated in the Nibelungenlied, and the Rosengarten, an epic probably of the late 13th century. Worms was rebuilt by the Merovingians and became an episcopal see, first mentioned in 614, although a bishop of the Vangiones had attended a council at Cologne as early as 347. There was a royal palace from the 8th century, and in it the Frankish kings, including Charlemagne, occasionally resided. Under the German kings, the power of the bishops of Worms gradually increased. Otto I granted extensive lands to the bishop, and in 979 Bishop Hildebold acquired committal rights in his city. Burchard I, bishop, 1000-25, destroyed the castle of the Franconian house at Worms, built the cathedral, and laid the foundations of the subsequent territorial power of the see. There were frequent struggles between the bishops and the citizens who espoused the cause of the emperors against the church, and were rewarded by privileges which fostered trade. The city retained its freedom until 1801 in spite of the bishops who ruled a small territory south of the city on both sides of the Rhine, and resided at Ladenburg near Mannheim till 1622. The city of Worms was frequently visited by the imperial court. The Concordat of Worms closed the investiture controversy in 1122. The perpetual peace Ewiger Landfried, was proclaimed by the Emperor Maximilian I at the Diet of 1495, and Luther appeared before the famous Diet of 1521 to defend his doctrines in the presence of Charles V. 4 years later, Worms formally embraced Protestantism, and religious conferences were held there in 1540 and 1557. It suffered severely during the 30 Years' War. The French under Meilhac burned the city almost entirely in 1689, and had only fully recovered from this blow in recent years. Thus, the population, which in its prosperous days is said to have exceeded 50,000, had sunk in 1815 to 6,250. By the Treaty of Worms in 1743, an offensive alliance was formed between Great Britain, Austria, and Sardinia. The city was annexed to France at the Peace of Lunéville in 1801, together with the bishop's territories on the left bank of the Rhine. The remaining episcopal dominions were secularized in 1803 and given to Hesse-Darmstadt, which acquired the whole by the Vienna Congress in 1815. On this day in history, September 24th, 1830, a revolutionary committee of notables forms the Provisional Government of Belgium. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Provisional Government. On the evening of September 23rd, there had been constituted an administrative committee which took the title of Provisional Government. It included Rogier de Hoogvorst, Joly, F. de Medour, Gendembien, Van de Veer, and after the 28th, L. de Potter. The revolutionary government took no further notice of the States General, which on the 29th voted in favor of the separation of the two parts of the kingdom. It also refused to negotiate with the Prince of Orange, whom the king had sent to Antwerp, and who, exceeding his instructions, went so far as to reorganize the Belgians as an independent nation. On October 4th, the provisional government had itself proclaimed national independence, paying no attention either to the king or to the powers which had set up the kingdom of the Netherlands. The revolt was thus not merely against William, but also against Europe. On the same day as it proclaimed national independence, the provisional government summoned a congress to draw up the constitution of the country. The congress met on November 10th. In the meantime, the Belgians had captured Antwerp. General Chasse maintained his position in the citadel and bombarded the town from there. The only result was to exacerbate the hatred felt for the king and the dynasty. On November 24th, the Congress voted the perpetual exclusion of the House of Orange from the throne of Belgium. On this day in history, September 25th, 275, for the last time, the Roman Senate chooses an emperor. They elect 75-year-old Marcus Claudius Tacitus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Marcus Claudius Tacitus, Roman emperor from September 25th, 275 AD to April 276, was a native of Intermina, Terni, in Umbria. In the course of his long life he held various civil offices, including that of consul in 273. 6 months after the assassination of Aurelian, he was chosen by the Senate to succeed him and accepted by the army. During his brief reign, he set on foot some domestic reforms and sought to revive the authority of the Senate, but after a victory over the Goths in Cilicia, he succumbed to hardship and fatigue, or was slain by his own soldiers, at Tyana, in Cappadocia. Tacitus, besides being a man of immense wealth, which he bequeathed to the state, had considerable literary culture, and claimed descent from the historian. On this day in history, September 26th, 1087, William II is crowned King of England and reigns until 1100. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the early reign of the king. William II, born circa 1056, died 1100, King of England. Surnamed Rufus, was the third son of William I by his queen Matilda of Flanders. He seems to have been his father's favorite son, and constantly appears in the Conqueror's company, although, like his brothers, he was carefully excluded from any share in the government. A squabble with Rufus was an immediate cause of Robert's first rupture with the Conqueror. In the ensuing civil war, we find Rufus bearing arms on the royal side, 1077 to 80. On his deathbed, the Conqueror was inclined to disinherit his eldest son in favor of Rufus, who, by the early death of Prince Richard, was now left second in the order of succession. But Normandy was bequeathed to Robert, while Rufus was designated as King of England. Rufus was crowned at Westminster on September 26, 1087, 15 days after the death of his father. On this day in history, September 27th, 1669, the Venetians surrender the fortress of Candia to the Ottomans, thus ending the 20-year-long siege of Candia. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Candia, the largest city of Crete, to which it is given its name, is situated on the northern shore in 35 degrees 20 minutes north latitude and 25 degrees 9 minutes east longitude. It is still surrounded by its extensive Venetian fortifications. The principal buildings are the Venetian Loggia, mutilated recently, the prefecture, 14 mosques, the modern cathedral, 2 Greek churches, the Armenian church, the Capuchin monastery, the bazaars, the baths, and some beautiful Venetian fountains. The town is the seat of a Greek archbishop. The highly interesting museum contains antiquities found during recent excavations. The chief trade is in oil and soap. The coasting trade is of considerable importance. Leather for home consumption is made, and good wine is produced in the neighborhood. The harbor is formed, for the most part, by the ancient moles, and was never deep enough to admit the larger vessels, even of the Venetians, which were accustomed to anchor off the neighboring island of Standia. The site of Candia, or, as it will till lately locally known, Megalocostro, the great fortress, has been supposed to correspond with that of the ancient Heraklion, the seaport of Knossos, and this name is now officially revived. The ruins of Knossos are about 3 miles to the southeast. Founded by the Saracens in the 9th century, Candia was fortified by the Genoese in the 12th, and was greatly extended and strengthened by the Venetians in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. It was besieged by the Turks under the Vizier Achmet in 1667 and was forced to surrender in 1669. During the German invasion of Crete in May 1941, the city suffered heavily. Population, estimated from 1938, 43,550. On this day in history, September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey disembarks at Pelusium upon arriving in Egypt, whereupon he is assassinated by the order of King Ptolemy XIII. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Pompey during the Civil War. The crisis arrived with the approaching end of Caesar's command at the end of 50. Pompey nearly compromised by accepting the Parthian command and leaving Rome, but Marcellius forced his hand, and civil war began. Pompey, wisely or unwisely, abandoned Italy. His cause, with that of the Senate and aristocracy, was finally ruined by his defeat by Julius Caesar in 48 in the neighborhood of Pharsalus. The same year he fled with the hope of finding a safe refuge in Egypt, but was treacherously murdered by one of his old centurions as he was landing. He was 5 times married, and 3 of his children survived him, Gnaeus, Sextus, and a daughter, Pompeia. On this day in history, September 29th, 61 BC, Pompey the Great celebrates his 3rd triumph for victories over the pirates and the end of the Mithridatic Wars on his 45th birthday. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Pompey as the consul. The Senate was inclined to grudge it, so he entered into a coalition with Crassus, and as both had armies at the gates, there was no more to be said. Pompey and Crassus were consuls together in 70, and that year saw the work of Sulla undone. The tribunate and censorship were restored, and the administration of justice was shared between the Senate, the Equites, and the Tribuni Aeriari. Pompey rose still higher in popularity, and on the motion of the tribune Aulus Gabinius in 67, he was entrusted with an extraordinary command over the greater part of the empire, especially for the extermination of piracy in the Mediterranean, by which his corn supplies of Rome were seriously endangered, while the high prices of provisions caused great distress. He was completely successful. The price of corn fell immediately on his appointment, and in 40 days the Mediterranean was cleared of the pirates. Next year, on the proposal of the tribune Manilius, his powers were still further extended, the care of all the provinces to the east being put under his control for 3 years together with the conduct of the war against Mithridates VI, who had recovered from the defeats he had sustained from Lucullius and regained his dominions. Both Caesar and Cicero supported the tribune's proposal, which was easily carried in spite of some opposition in the Senate. Pompey was entirely successful. Mithridates was beaten and driven into the Crimea. and there was a general settlement of affairs in the east. Syria and Palestine were annexed in 64 and 63. Tigranes of Armenia submitted and was confirmed as a vassal king, and an agreement was reached with Phraates of Syria, whereby the Euphrates marked the boundary between them. Pompey, now in his 45th year, returned to Italy in 61 to celebrate the most magnificent triumph which Rome had ever witnessed, as the conqueror of Spain, Africa, and Asia. On this day in history, September 30th, 1342, the Battle of Morlaix in the 100 Years' War is fought. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Morlaix, a town of western France, capital of an arrondissement in the department of Finistère, 37 miles east by northeast of Brest, on the railway to Rennes. Population from 1936, 12,962. Coin finds suggest that Morlaix was probably occupied in the time of the Romans. The Counts of Leon held the lordship in the 12th century, but the Dukes of Brittany disputed possession with them, and in 1187, Henry II of England, guardian of Arthur of Brittany, besieged and took the town. During the 100 Years' War, Morlaix was held by French and English in turn, and was pillaged by the latter in 1522. Mary, Queen of Scots, on her way to be married to the Dauphin, made solemn entry into Morlaix in 1548. The town having joined the League, the castle was taken by storm in the name of Henry IV in 1594. Morlaix lies 5 miles from the English Channel in a narrow valley. Below the town, the river Dosson widens into an estuary, the mouth of which is commanded by the Château du Tarou, built in 1542 for the defense against the English. Among the churches are St. Martin des Champs, 17th to 18th centuries, a Dominican church, a Carmelite chapel, St. Melanie, 15th century, and St. Mathieu, 16th century. The railway from Paris to Brest crosses the valley on a 2-storied viaduct 200 feet above the quays. Morlaix contains several wooden houses of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. These have large covered courts with huge open fireplaces. The town has a sub-prefecture, a tribunal of commerce, and a chamber of commerce. Industries include the manufacture of tobacco, tanning, brewing, and the manufacture of casks, wooden shoes, and candles. There is trade in grain, agricultural produce, oilseeds, leather, wax, honey, and in horses and other livestock. Fruits and vegetables are exported to Great Britain and the Channel Islands. The port, consisting of an outer tidal harbor and an inner basin, admits vessels drawing 16 feet at spring tides and 11 feet at neap tides.